right, good morning, everyone. First off, I'd just like to thank everyone for welcoming me here to UNC System meeting, the Board of Governors meeting here today. I was on the phone with my dad. I used to tell us a little bit of a story, but before I was coming down here. I talked to my father pretty regularly, and I was letting him know I was going down to UNC. I was going to be in Chapel Hill today to talk with you all and talk a little bit about the state of North Carolina and higher education in general. And he got very upset. And the reason for this is my father is a very die-hard college basketball fan. And when it comes down to it, I can't figure out why. He's from Pennsylvania. He lived in Texas for a very long time, yet he is a Kansas fan. And I actually have no idea why he's a Kansas fan, to state that as well. And he basically said, well, when you go there, you need to tell Coach Williams, I'm still very upset that he left Kansas and went to North Carolina. And I had to step back and say to my father, I don't think you know what I do for a living. I really don't. It has no application here whatsoever. So I always have to tell that as a little of what he's still upset that Coach Williams left and came here and did quite well. Still holds that grudge apparently somewhere inside there. The other thing I always have to say is I take out my phone, I put it here on the table. I'm not checking Facebook at any time. I'm not checking social media. I've been asked if I do that during presentations. I don't. Perhaps other millennials who you see present might do something like that. But I actually have a pregnant wife at home. So I have an emergency ringtone that if you hear it go off, you may see a mat-shaped hole in the wall as I sprint out of here, just to let you know. So likely none of that will happen, but just want to give those caveats. What I'm going to talk about today is a little bit of our research we've done at EAB into what we call performance-based funding. I know it's been a topic of your conversation, something you've seen presented at previous board meetings as well. What I hope to do is give you a very large overview, a national picture of what we have seen from states, from state systems, from institutions, from policy experts, and open this up to discussion and dialogue. What I'd like to do is hear from you, questions you might have, things that I can help clarify. Very much like Andrew, I put a lot of information in here and tend to go through it at a pretty good pace. But at any point, if you have questions, comments, concerns, anything like that, please don't hesitate to jump in and let me know. When I think about performance-based funding, it's one of those topics that we have looked at for some time now. We've looked at for many years, and yet the results are not necessarily concrete. We don't exactly have a great sense of what's going on. But I want to talk about these three distinct areas to give you a bit of that foundation. First is we call performance funding 2.0, why it might work this time. And this is a bit of our second foray into performance funding in higher ed. We sometimes joke that performance funding has been the cicadas of higher education, comes out in force every 17 years or so, and that's why it's out here. But I want to talk about where it's come from, where it's going. I'll then talk about balancing competing goods. There are many questions to ask when thinking about performance funding. And within any system, within any institution, there are the goods that you have to put in terms of the mission of different institutions, the mission of different student populations, the focus on what outcomes to track, all of those different competing goods. And I'll lay out some of the questions for those. And finally, I'll talk about the results. What have we seen? What have good data and studies been able to prove or show about performance or outcome-based funding? And again, the results vary, and there are lots of questions that remain in terms of what will happen. But I'll walk through each one of these in turn and give you an idea of what's going on. The easiest part to start with, who's doing what and how many states actually have a performance or an outcomes-based funding system? Now, at current, when we looked at before 2010, we had about 4 states, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Ohio, Indiana, that were actively implementing, pursuing performance-based funding. Since that time, we've got now a total of 37 states that are pursuing this. Now, the problem with this is there's a disagreement on exactly how many states are pursuing performance-based funding. It's, again, not always set in stone, which is a bit of the challenge to this as well. Some states have started to put together a formula. Some states have put together a formula and not implemented such a formula. Some have fully implemented a formula. So again, there's not always clarity into who's doing what in how many states. Best example I can give of this is actually an anecdote. A few months ago, I was at a meeting at our own offices at EAB. We had about 50 provosts from around the country together discussing major issues in higher education. And I put up this same slide and talked about states that were pursuing performance-based funding or had systems in place. And I kindly had a provost raise their hand and say, well, actually, you can take us off that chart. We're no longer pursuing performance-based funding. I had their colleague from the same state sort of nudge them in the arm and say, actually, we're still pursuing it. We've just moved on to something else. And so they sort of retracted that. I said, well, no, never mind. That's OK. We're still doing it. So we don't have a clear idea. And even in a lot of cases, states don't always have the clearest idea of what their system is, how it's implemented, what it'll look like. These are the best numbers and best estimates we can give of current, of who's actually pursuing this. There's also definitions of what is performance-based funding. If you're going to say that we have it as a state, if you're going to say we're going to implement it and we're going to put this as a policy, how do you define it? Well, again, there's no one definition to it. It varies across states. It varies across institutions. There's HCM Partners here that has put together an interesting topography, taxonomy, if you will, of different funding systems for outcomes-based funding. This is one of the best that I've seen to try to qualify the different components or the different characteristics of performance-based funding. I have no intention of reading through all of the different bullet points in here. I'll leave that for your review. But basically moving from type 1, which is a very rudimentary type of system, very little funds are actually at stake, very little outcomes are necessarily tracked. It's not going towards base funding, it's much more bonuses, all of these different questions. Not much of an effect or impact here. But you can move all the way up to, say, type 4, which is a very advanced type of system of performance-based funding. Most would say that if we have a substantial amount of funding at risk, if we have different metrics and weights by sector and by institution, if this has been something that's been put in place for several years and tracking the outcomes, you'd fall much more into the advanced category. Realistically, HCM, most people would only put 2 states in that category, Tennessee and Ohio, that have moved along in this way and have this much at risk. So you can see all the different variables, all the different characteristics of how this might be. And we also see states moving from one type to the other as you go through this, as things change, as the system's developed, as their criteria change. But you can use this as a bit of a base for this. Now, we say, why might this work this time? Why might it be having a greater level of staying power? We go back to, what do you say, performance-based funding, or PBF 1.0. You see over on the left-hand side are just some of the states that initially pursued some of these initiatives in performance-based funding in the 1990s. What you have here are the years that they took to put a system in place and then end that system that they had put in place. Over here, Colorado, 2 years, Georgia, 2 years. I call out South Carolina, your neighbor to the south there, had a system in place, was working on a system that took about 3 years, and in the end actually pulled back and didn't implement that system. The true reason here was because I feel that they looked at inclusiveness as the major part of this. They wanted everybody to have a say in every single indicator, every single factor that would be tracked. In the end, they came up with 37 different key performance indicators. 37 different data points that you would track and that would report on outcomes, so much so that you could not really determine which one of those is going to make an impact at my institution. How can I use this to determine strategy and set forth what we're going to do for the future? Overly complex. The other issue that we saw in South Carolina, and that I've seen in quite a lot of other states as well, is the actual allocation of funds that would go towards outcomes or performance-based funding dropped from 38 to 3% after a budget shortfall in the state. At that point, many institutions would say, I have 37 indicators that I have to be successful on for 3% of the total state allocations to higher education. In the quick cost-benefit analysis of that, it might not be worth my time to do it. This was what we heard. I have a picture up here of my colleague. Literally, we tasked him with going out and putting together all of the different performance-based funding systems, trying to tell us and define what states were doing what. This is the Excedrin migraine headache that he got every day in trying to do that. Because there was the lack of consensus, the lack of agreement of exactly what performance-based funding is, who had it, how long it would be, what the indicators would be. And a great report here is state officials not infrequently disagree in their understanding of what PBF is and whether their state even has it. The same thing of our provosts who are sitting in the room, not necessarily understanding, do we have it, is it implemented, what is it? That's a little of where we came from. I do jump here to why this is a little bit more important today and what has been a big part of the dialogue. Many people say we've already talked about the funding of higher education in the country. And if we look at state funding of higher education, it had declined, particularly in the coming out of Great Recession era. We saw a very, very large uptick in tuition dependence of schools, relying more on student tuition than on state funding dollars for public education. What we look at now is that state appropriations across the country in aggregate are up by a few percentage points. They've come back a little bit. There is general agreement it's not going to go back to where it was pre-recession in terms of levels. There's still the feeling that state funding is continuing to decline, that a lot of our reliance is on tuition dollars, is on other sources of revenue for the institution. Now, what we would hear from many institutions is they say, we see performance-based funding, we see this system of outcomes-based funding as a better way to accommodate or in some cases even hide some of the cuts that we see in terms of funding. These are some quotes that we had from some administrators that I think are good to quantify or sum this up. Harder to detect cuts, that as we see declining funding, some individual institutions see more funds under competitive performance-based funding formulas, but most schools will be losers, and there may be less overall to go around. I wonder if a little motive of performance funding is to continue the trend of defunding public higher education while avoiding the publicity fallout. This is a quote from a senior administrator of a public master's institution. The feeling was that as we saw the shrink, some people would do well, some people would get more funding from the state, but most would not. You'd get a smaller part of a shrinking pie of funds. That's what we have in that second quote as well. That if it doesn't get traction, it'll be because the increase in outcome-based funds is dwarfed by the decrease in overall funding. The pie overall is shrinking over time. That was a little of how this was viewed in terms of what was funding, and why people saw this might be the way that we can focus and concentrate some of the funds coming from state or going to public higher education. That's a little of the sentiment. That's a little of what we heard in the dialogues. But the reality is that there is still a great focus on implementing these systems. There's a focus on tracking outcomes, looking at performance. And so I want to show you what we've heard in a lot of our conversations, a lot of the dialogues around what goes into a system. When it comes to the model, when it comes to what a state might implement, what a system might implement as well, I'd say here are the big questions. Here are the competing goods that most institutions have to wrestle with when figuring out performance-based funding. Over on the left, I'd say the current pressures are most on what are the right measures. And this is the balance of mission, diversity, types of institutions, the balance of the different types of schools, colleges, universities that we have within a given system. So I'll talk a little bit, how do we account for diverse missions? We certainly have state flagship institutions. We've got those that have a very research focus. We've got those much more access, mission-focused types of institutions. Do we measure them on the same scale? Can they be put up against one another when it comes time for competitive funding? Are there students? Are there populations? Are there even academic programs that we overweight? If we have students that are more successful, Andrew talked a lot about our different students that come to higher education. We'd even get to the program level. Do we overweight some of those in the funding formula? Do we look at intermediate achievements? Do we look at just completions? There's a lot of questions of, do we track credit accumulation? That students that get 30 or 60 or 90 credits towards a degree? Or do we just reward the degree that is attained? How do we balance those? And do we track career outcomes? How do we track career outcomes? We talked about this as well. Very difficult to do across state lines. We have students moving. There are questions of FERPA regulations beyond that. There's lots of questions about how do we track career outcomes. Can that be a part of the funding formula? And then the future needs, I'd say, are the change levers. How much funding is at risk? That may be one of the biggest questions that states will put out there, of how much of the funding to public education should actually be measured against an outcomes-based system. How do we manage the movement towards a system like this for different performers? Is there a transition period that we can put in place? These are the main questions, and I want to just give a brief overview, an example of each one of them, and then turn over to some of the results we've seen before we take questions and open it up for dialogue. I start with the questions of the design flaws that we saw in previous formulas and how that's starting to be corrected now. We look at, I'd say, PBF 1.0, moving to the 2.0 model here. Most of what we saw previously in, say, the South Carolina model, other models, were most of the funds were in bonuses. This was outside of the core funding that an institution would receive. And in that way, it was only a bonus that an institution would receive, not necessarily losing core funding. Most of what we see now are core funding at risk, or the base funding going to public institutions being up at risk and being measured in these pieces. The trivial funds, I think, is another piece, that if it's only a very small percentage, 1%, 2%, which we do see quite a lot of, how much effort am I going to put into achieving these outcomes or focusing on them if there isn't actually much in terms of benefit to me as an institution from a financial perspective? Now we see at least many institutions focusing, saying, well, it has to be greater than 8%, 15%. Those sometimes are tracking Ohio and others have 100% of funding coming from this type of model. There is real value to then seeing that. There is signaling value to having more than 15% as well. So we're going to make sure there's those types of pieces. And also tracking counts versus rates. This was an interesting piece of not just tracking the percentage of a given cohort that might graduate, but aggregate enrollment and aggregate completions tracked year over year for an institution. In general agreement, this is what the new system was starting to move towards. That PBF 2.0 model that you'd start to discuss was trying to do more of this. But I always say, how do we then get to that balancing? If we take that into account, those three characteristics, and we look at what people are doing in terms of creating their formula, creating their funding, the question that first comes up is, how do we account for diverse missions? Now, just to give you an idea of what we have here on this side, up at the top, we have tried to chart out where we see different states along a continuum of these competing goods. Just to have these for generally each question we ask. This is not law put into place here. This is not exact in nature because of, again, the variability we found. This was our research team's best efforts at trying to put a state where we saw them along the continuum. So this may even have changed in the time that I'm talking here today, and a state may have moved in this. But you have on the left-hand side very standardized indicators. You have over on the right-hand side very customized indicators of what this looks like. And states can fall out anywhere in here. There are three states that I call out here to give you an idea of where they fall on the continuum. Tennessee has standard indicators. They have standard 10 criteria that every institution is going to be measured against for their outcomes. But there are different weights that they have for each different type of institution. This example I use, UT Knoxville, flagship research institution, differently measured when compared to UT Martin, a more access-focused mission educational type of institution. I'll show what that looks like. Missouri has more of a success menu of approaches. They've got 4 different indicators, 4 different large areas or buckets that you can actually look into, and then you have specific criteria, specific outcomes that you track that you can pick from that list. It's the best way to describe it, and I'll show a little of that. And lastly, Pennsylvania is that you actually have all schools measured against 5 standard indicators, and then the schools themselves put together 2 of their own indicators that they feel reflect the mission, the values, the unique goals of the institution. So you have a blend of those that are standardized, but also incorporating some that are going to be a bit blended. Give you an idea of what this looks like. On this slide, we've got Missouri over on the left-hand side, Tennessee over on the right. Your success menu from Missouri looks at student success, degree attainment, quality, financial efficiency, and then the optional metric that they can pick. Within that, you might pick any one of these different criteria that best reflects your institution. You might look at freshman to sophomore retention, or you could look at credit progression. For degree attainment, you can look at total degrees awarded or 6-year graduation rate, and so forth and so on for each one of those categories. But it allows the institution to define what are the standard criteria we'll use within that system. Tennessee, I think, over on the right does this in terms of the more weighted formula that they have. And again, we took here Knoxville versus Martin in terms of the comparison that you'd look at. You have the 10 criteria that are listed across the left-hand side. Students that have earned 30 credit hours, 60, 90, bachelor's and associate's degrees, and you can see how these types of criteria are weighted differently for different institutions. Best example, Martin's going to be much more heavily weighted on bachelor's degrees. They're going to be more heavily weighted on master's degrees. They will not be weighted at all on doctoral or law degrees because there is no comparison there when you look at Martin versus Knoxville. These types of characteristics are the ones where you as an institution can set what yours will be within a standardized set of those kind of metrics. This is how you have those balancing goods. When you have the unique missions put in place, how you can balance those different parts together. The next part, I think, is a very large part of this conversation is, can we overweight individual student populations? Can we overweight individual programs? Many states have taken into account, even as Andrew mentioned, Pell recipients, which is a bit of the proxy for low-income students in the country. The work that's done in terms of the outcomes for Pell recipients often has a bit of a completion premium or a promoter here that allows for increases for those institutions that do very well in terms of completions for Pell graduates. We also see this for other student populations uniquely tailored to the state that also fall in academic program areas. We've not seen this very large in nature. North Dakota has done this as a part of their funding formula, where they started to weight individual academic programs they felt were necessary for the local community as well as for the state. So you see over on the right-hand side is that those programs in their priority disciplines of business, engineering, and health sciences have a premium in terms of the weighting that they get for the completions and the success of students in those individual program areas. I've not seen this in a ton of states. I've not seen everybody adopt this model, but it does go to meet the unique needs of the state, unique needs of the mission of the overall goals of the state authority that they have there. So you start to weight out different student populations and different programs differently. Tracking career outcomes, I mentioned this very briefly because it is very difficult to do. The trick here in a lot of cases is we've seen pushback from institutions about the FERPA regulations in terms of there are very unclear rules and no institution wants to come up in terms of risk compliance and other issues that they have here in terms of the release of data and information, especially as students move across states and across borders. The other thing that we hear a lot about is we survey our students. We get information about them on a regular basis of where they are, what they're doing, what career fields they're in, what their salaries are. The data that we get from those tend to be somewhat inaccurate, tend to be unreliable, and are also very expensive to implement year over year. So questions are, can we continue to track career outcomes in that way? States have stepped in here in some sense to take a more strong role in terms of tracking career outcomes. I mentioned the state of Florida because Florida has actually started to have a statewide database of all the career outcomes, particularly for their college system. It will be more of your community college type system here for tracking career outcomes. In this case, it is a database that pulls together information from both the government, it pulls information from the Bureau of Labor, it pulls statistical information from the universities themselves, and tries to give a year-by-year report of how students are performing in terms of their career outcomes, in terms of their salary data, in terms of the work that they're doing. It's an imperfect system, though, again, here as well, mainly because this was only implemented because of something that happened back in 1995, where the state legislature in the state of Florida put together and mandated that this would actually happen. And from the state authority was able to collect that information and report it out. By that happy circumstance, when they put in their performance funding system, they were able to access this data and use it to track career outcomes. We have done a lot of research very lately in terms of what we call the return on investment, the career outcomes in higher education that we see across the country. And there's lots of debate about using salary as a credential, using that as a quantitative data point about success. Because there's a lot of comparison of first destination after graduation, where salaries might be higher for some STEM grads versus, say, liberal arts grads. There's how do we track that longitudinally over time in terms of career earning over a lifetime. All of that gets very, very complex and very, very murky, I'd say, when trying to use this as a part of an outcomes-based or a performance-based funding formula. But certainly a large part of the dialogue or debate there. And the last thing, I do have to mention this as well, is how we might track or how we might reward transfer. There's an ease of being able to actually track our first-time, full-time students coming to the institution, tracking how they are successful. But what about those students who transfer into the UNC system or transfer into one of our institutions? We put this out there because we have had this long-held theory and feeling from institutions that a great unbundling may happen in higher education, where students do not go to one institution for 4 years or 5 years or 6 years for one program, but they collect credits from a variety of different places and from a variety of different institutions. And then they piece that degree together as they see fit, and in this way can lower the overall cost of their education. Now, this has not necessarily happened just yet, but you could see how a student might start to be very critical of how much it costs to go to a higher education institution. We've got some of the numbers here that 6 years at a public university, if we're looking here at College Board trends in college pricing, can cost on average almost $140,000. Now, if I were to look at options for, say, 2 years at a community college and 2 years at a public institution and have that transfer opportunity, only be about $65,000. Now, we see this as a new opportunity for parents, for families, for students to analyze and think a little bit more critically about where they go to school, how they go to school, how much it costs. What we started to see is then transfer friendliness being also built into the outcomes or the performance-based funding systems. An example I pull actually here is from Michigan, where part of their system actually incorporates these different criteria and funding eligibility requirements, all based upon transfer. So for institutions to be eligible for a 3% part of the funding pool in Michigan, you have to participate in the student transfer network. You have to have transfer articulation agreements and reverse transfer with at least 3 community colleges, which means that a student can complete their associate's degree at the 4-year institution after transfer. They have to accept dual enrollment credits from the high schools, and they have to have tuition restraint, which is a limiting on the increases they have in tuition. Only by doing these types of things, only by meeting these criteria, can you be eligible for some of the bonus pool of money there for performance. So you start to track how we might have students moving through the system as well. That's a little of the initial questions about how you'd think about weighting and the different challenges that you'll face as you think about a system of this. The next, though, is what are the right change levers that we'd have here in terms of the incentives, the stability of a system? And the 2 big questions I'd like to mention here are first, how much funding should be at risk? Again, there is no one right answer here. I wish that there were one criteria, there was one model that everyone said, this is the amount that you should have, but it's certainly variable across different states. Those that we have there at the lower end, we have Illinois, Massachusetts, Washington, Missouri, Wyoming, and others, have, we'd say, those trivial amounts of funding actually at stake. When it is such a low amount of under 2%, you have to, as an institution, put yourself in their shoes of saying, how much effort do we put into this? How much do we focus on the weighted criteria? Some people would say, what's the point for us? We might be able to make that up in terms of some of our enrollments or make that up through philanthropy or other dollars here. We could put our efforts into that with greater success. We have others there that fall, say the bar, the line we're really looking here is about 15%. Most people agree that that's a bit of the visibility bar, where above that it seems to have more of an effect, seems to have a bit more of the impact for the institution in terms of what are the funds that are at stake here for these. The highest that we see on the chart are really looking at the states of Tennessee, Ohio, Nevada, North Dakota, where you're looking at fully somewhere between 80 and 100% of the funding is going to be based on the outcomes of the performance-based funding system. This breaks into things like completions, the same weighting we saw from Tennessee as well as others. But you have to still remember that even though that's 100% of the allocations coming from the state to higher education, that is still not the majority of revenues coming to those institutions. The majority of revenues, even in those states with the highest percentage of state funding, is still coming from enrollment types of criteria, tuition, as well as external financial aid to those students to the institution. So there's still focus here that even though a lot of the funding from the state's coming from this, there's a big focus still on the enrollments, the tuition, the students coming into those institutions. There is no one right model for these as well. There's been a lot of disagreement about how much should be at stake. We've seen them shift from time to time. We've seen them move up and down. We've seen them go from high to low. No, again, one right criteria. But you can see the swath, the spectrum of different approaches from states here about what would actually be put at risk. When we think about managing the risk here, that's the other question that comes in. As we phase in a system over time, as we implement a performance or an outcomes-based funding system, what are some of the things to take into account here? And here's what we've seen some states do. We have Washington, Missouri, and have learning years. These would be years where literally the institutions would not be affected by performance-based funding, but you'd be able to see how you would have performed if the system had been put in place. It allows a bit of that time for transition to institutions to understand what would actually happen to me. How do I prepare for this in 2 years or 5 years when it's fully implemented? We've seen stop-loss provisions. This is a limit in terms of the amount of funds that you can gain or lose given a certain time period of 1 year or 2 years or 5 years. These have fallen out of favor, quite honestly. Many of the conversations we've had with states of limiting the impact you'd see from the outcomes model, but we still have seen it as built in there to allow for some type of cushion for institutions not to see everything at risk. I think you'll see more of escalating risk pools, that money will actually increase in terms of the amount that's going to be at risk year over year in terms of, during the first year it might be 5%, in the second year 10%, third year 15%, and you can see it increase over time as institutions adjust. And the last one I think is very important is something we definitely found in Tennessee that is a great model, that is more of the rolling averages. Instead of saying that we're going to track year over year, there's a 3-year rolling average in which institutions are tracking their data and tracking their outcomes. And that way, 1 year of enrollment shortfalls or 1 year of particular challenges to the budget or the institution don't drastically impact negatively the institutions. So by doing those rolling averages, you're able to move into this in a more stable way and allow for that sustainability moving forward. I'm going to jump to this as well, but the last piece that I'll mention from Tennessee before talking about some outcomes and opening it up to some questions here are allowing for scenario planning for institutions. I think one of the biggest things I heard in the process of this research were individual institutions within state systems saying, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know how the funding formula is going to affect us. We don't know how we can plan for this year over year. When I'm trying to put together my 5-year or even a 10-year strategic plan or a 5-year budget plan, how do I account for this new system in place? Tennessee's put together this new tool that actually helps institutions anticipate what the impact will be. An institution within the Tennessee system can go in here and actually put in the changes they would see, put in their outcome metrics, and it will basically break out how they would compare to the other institutions within the state. It'll show them if they're going to receive an increase in funding. It'll show them if they're going to receive a decrease in funding. It can also change the accounts in terms of the state appropriations, if they should go up or down by certain numbers. Allows for this more interactive planning approach that's consistent across the system for all budget officers. Put this out there that it helps institutions understand if we are putting a system in place, how will it affect me? How do I use this to plan more effectively and consistently across all institutions within the state? And what that has led to is a little of this type of information. This comes from Tennessee when comparing the impact of their performance-based funding system from 2010-2011 years to 2013-2014. What you see is that there are winners and there are losers in the system. That some schools have performed very, very well, have increased the overall funding that they are getting from the state. There are those that have also seen decreases and declines over that same time period. There are questions of when we have these balancing goods, when we have this type of impact, what do we think we would have in terms of creating a competitive environment among institutions? We see systems as being very collaborative in nature, working together for the greater good of the system. In some cases, many people argue this puts each institution up against the other in a very competitive way that has negative impacts, that there's no longer the collaborative approach to system operations. You can see here just a little bit of it, that 6 schools together in Tennessee actually received less than 1% of a 14.6 increase in Tennessee state funding. Most of that went to other institutions. We call out some of these that have taken a lot of steps towards student success, towards student retention, have done great jobs, but at the expense of the other institutions. So when putting these together in these types of competitive formulas, there will be winners and there will be losers. That's a very clear thing that we have seen articulated. So what I want to round out with are just some of the results. And again, limited results, varying across the country, but those that I think stand out as being very important to recognize. The first are just some of the financial impact of performance-based funding or outcomes-based funding, and some key points that I think are very important to share. One is the decrease in Pell Grants per FTE that we saw in studies that were done of systems and of institutions that implemented performance-based funding. What does this mean? This means that we have fewer Pell recipients being admitted to performance-based funding campuses. In an effort to somewhat game the system, being the theory here, that we would admit fewer low-income students so that we could make sure that we were meeting the success and the completion goals and not taking the risk that might be associated with Pell recipient students. The other one that we see is the increase in institutional grant aid. This is the lower left. This could be better quantified as increase in merit aid to students, meaning we are putting more aid towards high quality students, tracking those students, trying to get them in the door. Again, using the finances we have to get high quality students in so that we can make sure we meet the outcomes goals that we have against the performance system. These would be negative impacts that we'd certainly be questioning when you try to break this out. But again, very hard to break out these numbers from the studies that we've seen. So again, an aggregate of different stools that have done this. So still a bit of question of what does this actually mean for the institutions. Over on the right, we've seen an increase in terms of student services expenditures, meaning we have taken money that have come from the increases in performance funding, or we have just tried to better improve our student outcomes, our student quality, student life on campus because of the impact of outcomes. The question again is where are the funds going in this case from student service increases? Some people say they go towards student success initiatives, advisors, success coaches, academic tutoring, academic counseling, other pieces, but very difficult to break out. There's also been the increase in overall instructional expenditures, meaning we're putting more money into the classroom. We're putting more money into faculty, into teaching and learning within the campus. So it's perceived that those are the positive outcomes. So you're looking here at really from the financial side, there are the negative outcomes of not necessarily admitting as many Pell recipients, of putting a lot more money towards some of our merit aid and instructional aid, but some of the funds we have going towards student success, student teaching and learning. When we get the other question of the mixed results around the country is in terms of completions. I think this is the hardest part because many people will say, we want performance-based funding, we want outcomes-based funding to be focused on the completions, on the graduation rates, on students getting degrees. Quite honestly, the results are, again, very, very mixed around the country. We looked at a good study that was done of both 2-year and 4-year institutions. You can see that there are almost an equal number of positives and negatives. We had an equal number of institutions that by implementing performance-based funding had no change whatsoever in terms of degree completions or degree conferrals in a lot of these. So from the pure perspective of looking at degrees, there's not necessarily a direct correlation here that success comes from performance-based funding in terms of outcomes of degrees. Again, studies are still mixed, the questions are still out on this, but there is no hard evidence that says performance-based funding leads to more degrees, leads to more credentials. There are more of the qualitative evidence of positive aspects and positive impacts of performance-based funding. Awareness of state priorities. If we are tying funds to the priorities of our state, there's much more knowledge about those. There's funding, as we saw on the previous slide, dedicated to instruction, dedicated to student services and student success. We look at developmental education, we look at tutoring improving. In those systems where certain students are weighted, certainly they're getting different funds. We're focusing on those populations. There's a lot more professional support for teaching. The course sequence and the curricula have actually improved. As institutions try to be more efficient, more effective, they would actually revamp the curriculum of their individual institution to make sure that it was meeting the needs of students, that it was in a way that was more successful, and also accommodating things like student major switching. When a student switches a major, they tend to have to go back and get more of the prerequisites again. If we're able to align more of our majors together, it allows for that timely degree completion in different ways. Those are some of the impacts we heard more anecdotally, not necessarily those from a strict data study that you would see in terms of outcomes. And the last piece I have to mention has got to be that no matter what you're doing in terms of outcomes-based funding, it is not a quick fix. The major results that we see show that there's a long amount of time that it takes for there to be success in terms of degree completions or outcomes for these models. If the goal is to change something for next year, performance-based funding and outcomes-based funding is likely not the right move. It is a long-term strategy for the institution or for the system to be thinking about from that perspective. Just some of the data here over on the left is it takes about 7 years from the data set of institutions and states that have implemented performance-based funding for there to actually be a change in terms of the 4-year completions of degrees. About a 7-year lag time between the implementation as well as the outcomes of that. The question here is can we look at this as a long-term strategy and not as just a quick fix that would go to this? Again, the results are limited, but these are the best bit of outcomes that we can look at from institutions to actually track. Are we improving completions? Are we improving finances? Are we being more efficient as institutions? So I leave you with this slide, again, looking at both the current and the future needs of institutions in terms of outcomes and performance-based funding. Some of the major questions that we have tried to wrestle with or tried to address in even looking at these systems or getting some kind of concrete answers about them. I think the greatest quote I heard is that the cement is still wet in a lot of states. We're not quite sure of what the outcomes will be. We're not exactly sure of what the financial outcomes will be, but there is general consensus that we would like to pursue and continue the discussions and find what the right model would be for an individual state. So I know this is me trying to go through as much about a complex financing system and complex performance-based system in approximately 35 minutes. I hope I was able to give you at least a good overview of what we have seen writ large around the country, and would love to open up for questions from you all, as well as questions for Andrew in his presentation.
Thank you, Matthew. Matthew, we're going to take questions for a while. I wanted to remind you that if you have a question, we have some people with microphones that would like to get you on when you ask a question.
I think we have a microphone.
Obviously, you've looked at a large number of these programs. Trying to follow you on this was sort of like what I would imagine speed dating is like, although I'm too old to have done that. Can you pull together for us and give us your estimation based on what you have seen of components of these programs that seem to be keys to success, that seem to have the greatest influence, and perhaps even more importantly, components that have either done no good or had a negative consequence?
I can do my best to answer that question and as well to get such a report out. The trick is that you have to look at the different weighting of this, that in total, it's hard to say that one individual criteria led to success for the whole model. Linking that up, it's the same thing that we look at from student success in general in the country, that institutions and systems and everybody focused on completion and retention of students will say we implemented 10, 20, 30 different changes on campus. Which one was effective and which one was not it's hard to make that direct connection. I can put together a report of here's the criteria that we have seen be most effective or that have been the most important in terms of determining the models. Again, I don't have the greatest results that directly link to those, but I can put something like that together and say, here's what I think. Most of them are laid out in here in terms of the questions to ask, the way to build them out. It's going to be unique to UNC, though. You're going to have to look at your individual institutions, your individual performance in that way. It will be very unique in that way, but I can put together those criteria. It'll be, I just want to admit, I cannot make the direct connection to exactly which metrics will be successful
But
there.
you've seen them, and you've been watching them for some years now. A lot of times that's the best way to do it.
Sure.
The metric charts are great, but they also don't always illuminate a lot of things. I'd much rather have the judgment of somebody who's actually watched it.
Sure. Can I call on anybody? I usually leave it to the chair to run the meeting. But.
I got one for you over here.
Okay.
I'm wondering what, if there are any findings regarding increased distortion of data that's reported. That's my first question. I would think that professors and faculty are under a lot of pressure to make sure that they don't lose funding. That's number one. Number two, with all these schools, like the chart that you showed from Tennessee, where only 2 of the schools were positive and the rest were negative with regard to funding, what happens there? Is there a negative impact on tuition? Do the states do anything to account for that?
To answer your first question, I don't have anything that concretely says we have seen distortions in terms of data reporting. Most of the data sets are handled by the states themselves and are often looked at in terms of again, cutting through data. Data is always a great murky area to either hide things or have a lot of questions go into those data sets. But I've not seen massive distortion of data and reporting. The question of data, and this is something Andrew even talked a little bit about, is how you might dilute academic quality. And I'm not sure if that's what you were referring to when you mentioned faculty in terms of their focus on funds, that we would have degree inflation or grade inflation of an individual program, that I want my students to complete in a program, so I'll inflate the grades so that they get through, but the academic quality is reduced. Hard to track, again, hard to actually quantify unless you have some type of licensure tests or you have some type of assessment that's actually built into an individual program. Others don't have that as clearly. So there's lots of questions, again, about that type of data distortion. As to your second question, if you could repeat it, I apologize.
The chart you showed that showed only 2 of the schools in that state increased their funding. Does it put extra pressure to increase tuition, and do the states allow that?
I think it puts a lot of pressure on the admissions or on the gateway in terms of higher education. That those institutions might then focus, as we mentioned, some of the later data of the quality of students that they enroll, or the students that they are bringing to the institution, or their admissions criteria of making sure the students they bring in might be able to bump up some of those numbers, allow them to compete more successfully in terms of performance and outcomes. It's also had them be a little bit more strategic in terms of alternative revenues or other types of revenue streams to the institution. We've seen boost in terms of focus on advancement and philanthropy. We've looked at alternative revenues and auxiliary revenues from those institutions. And some will even look even more at more of the efficiency side of that. That if we can reduce our overall costs and be more effective, that can lead to quality outcomes, but also reduce the financial costs of it. It does lead to competition from those institutions, though. The ones that you see that are the largest performers on those charts did some great things around student success in terms of tracking outcomes, tracking results that were going to lead to those end results. And then there's also the sharing, though. We did see the collaborative learning that happens, that those that were successful were able to share some of those experiences with the other institutions in the system, which did lead to overall success or improvements on those sides. Okay, in the back there. Sure.
Matthew, thank you for your presentation. I would hate to have to communicate that much information in 35 minutes. By analogy, let me ask you to differentiate this. It seems in our medical delivery system in the United States recently, past 8 years or so, there has been a similar analysis made and an imposed control system on individual doctors and doctors' practices, limiting time with patients, limiting compensation to how many patients you see, and so forth and so on, with less emphasis on personal interaction and personal relationship between the doctor and the patient. Certainly, efficiencies have gone up. Doctors spend less time with patients. Prescriptions are written with less time, but there is no guarantee that the actual care delivered is better. It seems to me that education is even more of an individual relationship-based enterprise than medicine. And to control an institution by turning on and off the spigot based on arbitrarily set, or maybe not arbitrarily set, but based on criteria set by someone else is no guarantee in the long run that the education delivered will actually be better. Could you comment on that, please?
I happily admit I'm not an expert on healthcare and healthcare performance at all. My wife is. My wife works in healthcare research. I would love to call her on the phone and ask her some of those questions when they come up. The only reaction I would have to that and sort of commentary on it is that when we think of the outcomes, we think of the focus of students and their engagement with academics or with faculty or with the core part of our institution. Andrew again mentioned the Gallup-Purdue Index, which actually tracks and shows that affinity to institution, lifetime success, sort of outcomes of a student in college or university are very directly related to their interaction with faculty members, the experiences they have on campus that can't be quantified always in the same way, that there are those kind of outcomes that are harder to track. Now, what we start to see, though, is when you look at these kind of formulas and you track outcomes and you think about where faculty spend their time and what they're doing and how they focus, there is the specialization of those, the focus on, say, student success administrators. There are those who focus on advising or focus on career outcomes or focus on service learning beyond what faculty do. And we focus faculty time on teaching and learning in the classroom and research and those components that I think are most important to them. So that rather than trying to dilute the faculty time with students being pulled in so many different directions, you almost focus it in a lot of ways on the areas where faculty should be focusing that lead to some of those better outcomes. That's what we've seen in a couple of different models, or seen the focus or the shift. And it can have both the qualitative benefits that we see from some of the surveys, but also the quantitative outcomes benefits in terms of degree completion, course sequence completion, et cetera, from other institutions. So there is a little bit of a fine balance there of focusing the efforts and times of our faculty, of our experts a little differently. Yes.
With the big data available to us, how much modeling has been done on this sort of a system, looking at like a Watson trade-off analytics to see what the impact of these various decisions are and what the outcomes likely will be? That's my first question. The second question is drilling down into departments rather than looking at the university itself or the system itself and then each university. Are there any performance-based models for department level? And then last question is, how much can someone really impact the outcomes of these success metrics? So are we putting a model in place that someone can actually change and succeed, or are we putting a model in place that's going to have an outcome that's just going down a path towards that?
I think that in answer to your first question, the best example, the Tennessee modeling system that they have in place that allow institutions to see what will be the impact of the model for them is probably the best that I've seen that gives that pretty clear example of it. I would quote them and allow them to answer any more detailed questions or specific questions about how that model is built or how they've seen it affect the performance of institutions. To your second question about department level incentives or department level performance, one that does jump to mind is one that we profiled at EAB. It's actually from the University of Wisconsin-Eau Claire, regional part of the UW system that does track individual performance of academic departments. They have individual metrics around student success, around completion, around assessment in the classroom that allows them to put together a very large matrix that you can compare how the individual department is performing and how the individual department is compared to another department or all departments within the overall institution in the university. From that model, they have small amounts of funding that are based on the performance of the individual units and the individual departments. It's not a massive amount of funding, it's not large base funding, it's additional bonuses that go to the departments to change the unit level performance of that institution. That's the one example that I can say comes to mind where they actually do track that level of departmental funding and departmental performance. I think overall, though, for the last part of your question, what we have seen is how do we improve the performance of those who may not see this writ large? If you're looking at the big picture of performance funding and outcomes funding, how do we support those individual departments? In some cases, it's through data, through analytics, through better performance metrics, through curricular changes at the institution. All of those add up into trying to drive performance or drive changes at the individual department level and have been successful from the system down through the institutions, down through the individual academic departments and units on campus. So that's the best way I can answer that part. Yeah, please.
Hi, thanks so much for coming. So you talked a little bit about the winners and losers, and especially with Tennessee. And I guess my question is there a pattern in who you see as winners or who wins? Is it typically maybe a flagship university or a research-focused university? Have you seen any patterns in the systems that you've looked at?
No, is the short of that. And that's the trick of all this. You'd like to say that, hi, I've seen a very distinct pattern that allows me to say, well, all the state flagship institutions where there is performance-based funding in place have done better than the regional institutions or other serving institutions. Not seen that exactly. I give the one here, and there's been a lot of media stories about Austin Peay State University in Tennessee. Done phenomenal work in terms of student success, phenomenal work in terms of performance analytics for students to understand their degree programs. They are not the state flagship. They are a regional public serving part of the system there that has performed better than almost every other institution in that. So they'd be a bit of the outlier that sets apart from the rest. Their performance, their activities, the things they have done have been able to influence and even give guidance to other parts of the system for those institutional improvements. But I have not seen, and neither have I seen, a study that has shown there is one type of institution that does better than another. I think the weighting of the metrics goes into that as well. That if I'm being compared to the mission of my institution, the students that I enroll, the outcomes that we are looking for, then there can be more of the balanced type of approach of the outcomes you're looking for in that. Yes, please.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm so glad that my colleague brought up this notion of winners and losers. My concern, and I would love to hear your comments on this, it centers around student winners and losers. In the previous presentation, there was a graphic that showed when the funding was there that students who were poor graduated at the same rate as those who had money. But in your presentation, in this PBF, and I really appreciate you using my initials to name this, in this PBF model, the Pell Grants, those students who were poor, those students who were often first generation college students, were not sought after in order to get to the end result of improvement in that university system. Could you address that, and how is that maintaining equity and balance for our students, which is the number one objective of why we're all volunteering all our time?
Answer I would give to that has to go to a little bit of the outcomes we see is a small decline in terms of the total Pell recipients enrolling in performance-based funding institutions. Again, the data is still out there. There's still a lot of questions about the accuracy of all of those studies, but that's at least a good study we've seen that tracked and saw the decrease in terms of Pell recipients on campus. I think it does go to a little of the equity or the mission of the institution. We know that from a lot of data, from a lot of research out there, that Pell recipients, low-income students, need additional student supports. They often have lower 6-year graduation rates, 5-year graduation rates, 4-year graduation rates, higher opportunities and levels of dropping out of the institution. So from the institutional perspective, it often takes more resources to help those students be successful. and even to identify when they are at risk at certain times. There's a lot of other great data out there that shows that those students might be moving through okay, not hitting any academic alert systems and other systems we have in place, and still are very highly at risk of dropping out. But it takes pretty sophisticated data analysis, analytical platforms to do some of that and to help identify those students. So the trick, though, I think comes into, again, the weighting. If we were to weight Pell recipient students higher than we do for our traditional or core students in some ways, then there is a bit of, again, the incentive to enroll those students and have their outcomes be successful. But given at least some of the data we've seen from the reports and from the results, it has not necessarily gotten to that point just yet. I think it probably should be a focus. That's my personal perspective on this. I have to admit that that should be a focused population, a focused student population that we're not necessarily abandoning so that we can, in some ways, game the system and make sure that we get students in that are likely to graduate. But at least from the data we see, that has not yet been the case completely. Yes, please. You have no questions, Andrew.
Thank you. That presentation was a great deal to grapple with and wrap your arms around, but thank you for that. One thing that stood out to me was the need for a long-term commitment to actually have any idea whether this is going to be successful or to see success. And yet you couldn't even tell. Some states, they're in, they're out, not really sure, they're halfway in. What determines that will for the long-term commitment and for moving towards success with such a model? Is it a political will? Is it the complexity of explaining it? Is it administrative issues? What determines whether a state will really take this model and be willing to put that long-term commitment in place?
I don't know. I wish I, again, could quote a great study or quote a great research piece that says, here's how these types of systems have staying power and have that commitment. Conversationally and anecdotally, I think part of it is the commitment financially to this type of system, that if this is something that's going to be pursued, a large portion of the funds of base allocations are going to be put up as a part of the performance or the outcomes-based funding system. I also think it's certainly a more personal leadership perspective, that this is something that's set out as the strategic initiative or strategic mission of a system or of institutions or of a state, and it's followed through upon and not wavered upon at different times. Those models, when we say those, that we don't know which states might be competing or which ones are actually adopting a model today versus yesterday, that's basically a system in place where there aren't significant amounts of fund at risk, and there isn't a long-term commitment to it from both the state assembly, the state legislatures, from the state systems, from the institutions themselves to participate in these types of models. Again, no one right way to go about making sure that it has staying power and that it has that, but those would be anecdotally the things that have come up most often for me in conversation of why it has been effective over, say, 7 years or 10 years or even beyond that. I always feel very bad when I get a lot of questions and there is no one answer. As a researcher, you want that one answer that you can just very, very succinctly say, here is what it is. Performance-based funding and outcomes-based funding does not lend itself to that type of answer just yet.
Any other questions? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much.